First, I want to thank David and the Space Enterprise Council and Jeff and the Marshall Institute for inviting me to speak today at this discussion on space situational awareness. Before I begin, I think I need to provide a little background and a few disclaimers. I'm a retired Army officer who was wearing the same uniform as those two gentlemen in the back of the room just a couple of years ago. My last assignment was Director of Space Policy in the Office of the Secretary of Defense for Policy. Now the disclaimers. My remarks today are solely my own. Although it's based on my experience in space-related assignments while on active duty, my comments do not reflect any position of the U.S. government or my company. I'm also restricted from discussing any technical issues covered under ITAR, so I'm glad that Jurgen and Richard covered all the technical stuff, so I don't have to do that. Having said all that, there's not much left to say. As I mentioned, I served in several space assignments while on active duty, most recently in OSD policy from 2006 to 2009. When Jeff asked me to take part in this panel, he asked me to share some thoughts on the importance of space situational awareness from a national security space perspective. And I thought back on those times, and nearly every activity I worked in the Office of Secretary of Defense, SSA was either central to or the key issue in every one of those activities. So beyond the professional interest in this subject, I also have a personal interest. My son recently graduated from Purdue University, earned his Bachelor of Science in Aeroastroengineering. Better news, he's gainfully employed, working at AI Solutions in Lanham, Maryland. And any Boilermakers out there? No? Not one? Wow. One of the tasks that he's working on right now is doing conjunction analysis for 54 NASA missions in support of Goddard Space Flight Center. So he'll come home every night and tell me about all these conjunction assessment messages he's getting. And we were on vacation once, and he got home and turned his phone on, and it just had nothing but messages about conjunction assessments. So there's a lot of volume out there. It's a growth industry. That's good for him. But what I'd like to do in the next couple of minutes is just review a few of the more significant activities that took place over the last 5 or 6 years, specifically with regard to SSA, and make some observations about the national security community's response to those events. The week that I arrived at OSD, President Bush had just signed the first national space policy published since 9/11. That policy, quite appropriately, was primarily focused on national security issues. While it received less than stellar reviews, and I think some of you out here probably wrote some of those reviews, I want to focus on what it said about SSA. In the section outlining the responsibilities of the Secretary of Defense, it gave the Secretary responsibility for space situational awareness, a thing, and in that capacity, he would support the space situational awareness requirements of the Director of National Intelligence and conduct space situational awareness, an activity for the United States government, U.S. commercial space capabilities and services, national and homeland security, civil space, particularly human spaceflight, and as appropriate commercial and foreign entities. And then secondarily, the next bullet says, establish and implement policies and procedures to protect sensitive information regarding the control and the dissemination of the information that supported space situational awareness. So while he had a responsibility to conduct the SSA mission for the U.S. government, his customer set was very broad. And at the same time, he was responsible for protecting much of the data and information that provided the basis for the SSA mission. Concurrently, in my office, we were taking actions to transition what at that time was called the Commercial and Foreign Entities Program, a pilot program, to a permanent authority enabling the Department of Defense to provide SSA services to commercial and foreign entities. So as you can see, there's conflicting activities going on here. It required a constant balancing act between providing information for safety of flight and for other purposes, and at the same time protecting sensitive data. And as is the case always with broad national policy, the actions taken to achieve the policy goals are up to those individuals charged with implementation, and therefore are based on the assumptions, experiences, and personal vision of each of those individuals. Well, writing policy is difficult, and unfortunately I don't see any of our policy folks in here, but writing policy is difficult. Typically you end up with compromise language in a policy, but taking actions to actually implement the policy, compromise is much more difficult. So while some in the community aggressively pursued initiatives based on sharing information, others just as aggressively sought to protect information. A couple months later, just a few short months later, in January of 2007, China conducted their successful test of the direct descent anti-satellite system, destroying the Fangyang 1C satellite and creating debris that we're dealing with today. I checked the spacetrack.org website last weekend and found nearly 3,000 objects still attributed to FY1C debris being actively tracked today. So for the national security space community, this event not only presented new challenges for our SSA capabilities, more observations, more analysis, more conjunction assessment, but it also demonstrated that we had a new incredible threat. And in order for that threat to be successful, it relied on accurate SSA data. So needless to say, those in favor of protecting SSA information viewed this activity as all the justification needed. Just 2 short years later, in February of 2009, we had another significant and emotional event for the SSA community, the Cosmos-Iridium collision. I believe it was just after that event that you had the SSA panel in which I participated. As I recall, there were several folks there demonstrating their computer modeling of the debris field generated by the Cosmos-Iridium collision. So now, instead of a deliberate destruction of a satellite, we had an accidental conjunction, one for which no warning was issued, because at that time it was not something that we tracked in the same way as other higher priority assets. After this event, we placed more demands on our SSA enterprise to do more conjunction assessments. Rather than a few versus all things, we're now trying all things versus all things. That's a very, very difficult problem. We discovered that we're pretty good at forensics, figuring out what happened. But it's much more helpful to be able to predict and potentially avoid bad things from happening in the first place. Also during this time period, we had numerous studies going on. Roundtables, space posture review, and other efforts aimed at exploring various aspects of conflict in space. Deterrence, mission assurance, protection, among other things. We used to like to say that 70% of the Earth's surface is covered with water, the other 30% with launch studies. But at this point, I believe this new series of studies was catching up quickly with the launch studies. The one common thread among all of those studies was the need for decision quality situational awareness. Based on the real-world activities I just described, as well as the results of these studies, we were somewhat successful in DoD in getting additional resources to improve our SSA capabilities. But really, these were just marginal improvements. It was sort of the shovel-ready projects that were ready to go in SSA at the end of the budget cycle. So at the end of that, next administration comes in. And with the change in administration in the White House, space policy was chosen as one of the first issues to be addressed, which was a little surprising. The Director of Space Policy on the NSA staff, Peter Marquez, orchestrated a series of studies with broad interagency participation addressing the most difficult issues that we had encountered during implementation of the last space policy, and it had only been about 4 years since the last policy. Issues like protection, international cooperation, export control, improved acquisition and management. The results of these efforts provided the basis for much of the new national space policy signed by President Obama. This policy refers to SSA first in the context of preserving the space environment and the responsible use of space. So whereas before it was a thing that the Secretary of Defense did, now it was an activity that had a purpose. The first bullet under that said, develop, maintain, and use space situational awareness information from commercial, civil, and national security sources to detect, identify, and attribute actions in space that are contrary to responsible use and long-term sustainability of the space environment. There's a how and a why in the policy statement, as opposed to what was before just a what. The second bullet under that had to do with research to mitigate debris, on-orbit debris, reduce hazards, and increase understanding of the current and future environment, the things that Jürgen just covered here. That's a very, very difficult problem, and one that a lot of folks are working on right now. But again, those things are typically fairly expensive, and we lack the technology to be able to do that in an effective manner. Another one of the aspects of SSA in the new space policy was fostering the development of space collision warning measures, something that the Space Data Association has taken on to, in the commercial environment. But this is also one of the objectives for the national policy. The responsibilities for the SecDef in this policy was to be responsible again for SSA, but also to develop capabilities, plans, and options to deter, defend against, and if necessary, defeat efforts to interfere with or attack U.S. allied space systems. The prerequisite condition for that last responsibility, again, is decision quality situational awareness. Without a clear understanding of what's happening in the environment, choosing appropriate options becomes very difficult. And as an aside, even developing feasible options from which to choose is not a trivial problem. Lastly, we had a couple of other activities here recently that highlighted the importance of space situational awareness to the average person. A series of high-interest, uncontrolled reentries of large satellites, URs in September, ROSAT in October, and Phobos-Grunt in January, all raised the possibility of a satellite causing serious damage or injury on the ground. While the likelihood was low that any of these vehicles would cause such damage, nevertheless the demand for accurate SSA products was high and will continue to increase. And as all of you know, you see the error bars on those reentry predictions. They're pretty big, take up roughly the third of the Earth. So hard to predict where those things are coming in. But another key point that Jürgen brought up is education. Educating people as to what SSA can do and can't do. And when you come to the reentry predictions, people just don't understand why you can't tell me exactly where those things are going to come down. So, in conclusion here, I'd like to offer some observations. The last 6 years has been eventful for those associated with SSA. So here's a couple of observations I'd like to offer. There's always going to be a tension between security and transparency in space situational awareness. Personally, I believe that there are ways to achieve a reasonable balance, but it does require understanding from both sides. There will always be resource constraints, limiting our ability to improve space situational awareness. It's very difficult to quantify the added value of situational awareness. So when these SSA programs compete against other programs, specifically in the Department of Defense, where these other programs can be shown to address known capability needs or mitigate gaps, SSA capabilities always fall short. As I mentioned earlier, it was only in response to external events that we were able to secure some funding for a few SSA programs that were ready to go. In today's fiscal environment, it will be more difficult. Number 3, decision makers always want more information. We need to accept the fact that we will always lack sufficient information when it comes to space situational awareness. And we must still be prepared to take actions, prudent actions, lacking adequate information. We all know it's in the best interest of all space operators to minimize debris and maintain the ability to avoid accidents. But designing these attributes into space vehicles either adds costs or reduces performance. It's up to responsible space operators to make these trades. And I know our State Department colleagues are working on some of the implementation actions of the new National Space Policy to convince folks that this is the right thing to do. So, in conclusion, space situational awareness is a foundational requirement for the national security space community and essential for spaceflight safety for all operators. I believe we must continue to find ways to improve our capabilities through investments in sensors, processing, human capital, and relationships. Over the last 5 or 6 years in particular, we've adapted our SSA enterprise in response to a variety of external stimuli. I believe we're better now than we were before. We still have a lot of work to do, and the space environment will continue to increase in complexity every day. So we need to be able to develop the tools that will enable us to deal with this increasingly complex environment. Thank you for your attention. I look forward to your questions.